Welcome to the ReThink podcast, where we just learned in our pre-show discussion and prep work
None of it's
that people are really watching the podcast and
stay away from social media.
Think it to be very beneficial.
Bad things happen.
I don't know who such people are, but
Well,
Julie Galloway.
Julie Galloway earned a anniversary follower badge on Facebook.
sweet.
I don't know what that's worth, but I'm assuming
Is it kind of like Feltboard?
I think it's like Facebook crypto. I mean, the value of that is only going to go up. So hang on to that, Julie. Someday,
Absolutely.
20 years from now.
that will be worth something.
Hodl.
Maybe.
Well, I told you that I've never read past chapter 3, verse 18. Wives, submit to your husbands, because I figure if you can't get right what you already know, why would it be valuable to know more?
Yeah, there's really nowhere else to go if you can't get that.
It's Jeff M. at Christchurch.com.
Oh, no, we're going to jump through chapter 4 and wrap up Colossians today in our discussion. And more practical stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Well, Matt and Ben, why don't you share with us some very insightful information here?
Well, for those of you that have read past chapter 3, you know that when you get to chapter 4, it's just a bunch of names. And so, actually, where this message kind of started for me was back in week 1 when you started the series, because you mentioned the people who we talked about. And so, in verse 9...
You know who they are?
I do. I know who they
Yes. 4 main characters.
are. Yeah, I don't think I could pass the test, though.
Review
Yeah,
time?
you want to do
Onesimus, Philemon,
that? I knew those two.
Tychicus, and
I knew that one.
Epaphras.
Epaphras. Yeah. I knew
Oh,
three
look
or
at
four-
that.
three or four.
So what's the story with
That's what I like.
Onesimus? Because that's one we elaborated on for the last couple of weeks.
We did?
Slave.
Oh, I did.
You did?
You didn't listen?
I listened to all 3 sermons in the room.
Yeah, I didn't really hear you say
I
that.
didn't either. Once you started with, he's throwing stuff now.
Thanks for joining us on the ReThink podcast. Julie?
You used one line about it.
Well,
and
it's important. It's included.
Well, yeah, and I actually looked at, I don't know who was in the booth, and I was like, oh, back off.
I know. Because I knew where you were going this week. And I toyed with the idea of stealing all of your information and making you write a new sermon.
Yep. Speaking of that, let's have a conversation about staying in your lane, okay? I mean... Yeah.
That's coming out.
Boy, who's this directed to?
I was gonna say,
Let's
where's
step out here.
I'm
got
gonna
something
go
to work
get some
through here.
coffee. There's like an intervention going on right now. I don't know what.
I'm
Listen,
about ready to
listen
get
after I
going.
read Wives, Submit to Your Husbands, I was looking for
Everything was
anywhere
off
else
the
I could go.
table. Everything was free. Anyway, I was reading through this, and verse 9 mentions Onesimus. And anyway, long story short, that's the route we went this weekend, which, man, I absolutely love this story. I don't know about you, but I didn't know all the connection pieces then.
No, and I think what's really cool, so the last couple times I preached, I've tried to do a big push on people being in the Word, not coming to church and just listening to what the pastor is reading or watching it on screen. Like, bring the Word yourself, get into it. And the reason why is one, like, it's the ultimate source of truth. Over us, you need to make sure you're pouring into that and verifying what we say with the Word of God. But the second reason is because, man, once you get into stories like this, you start to see just how amazing the Word actually is and how connected it is. And so you've got Colossians 4 running at the same spot as the story in Philemon. And so that's the story of Onesimus and returning back to Philemon. And so you're watching all of these play out. And so you've got all of these biblical principles that Paul is laying out in Colossians, and then you're seeing it actually play out in real time in the story of Philemon. So that's just, it's so rich. And so, yeah, that's my push. Get in the Word.
In case there would be a podcast listener who didn't catch the last couple weeks' sermons, fly-by view real quickly. Onesimus was... what?
Onesimus is the slave of Philemon. And so really the story plays out where Philemon, who is from Colossae, he leaves, goes to Ephesus. We don't know how long he went. He took his family. We don't really know. He shows up to Ephesus, and he runs into Paul. While he runs into Paul, Paul shares the gospel with him. He becomes a follower of Christ. He goes back to Colossae. He and his family start a church inside their home. They're doing that for a number amount of years. Acts 20 tells us that Paul is in Ephesus for 3 years. And so at some point in the story, the church in Colossae is started. Paul then leaves and he goes to Rome. And we find out that he is now in chains for Christ. He's under house arrest. Philemon goes back to his home at some point. He doesn't go back to Colossae and find this, but at some point he finds out that Onesimus has done 2 things. He's left and that he stole from him. And so Onesimus uses the cash or whatever he steals from Philemon. He finances a trip to really the furthest place he could get away, the largest city in the world. He goes to Rome.
Which is a long journey.
Long journey. Yeah, we used a really cool map made by Stefan. I think he spent more time working on the map than the entire sermon that I spent. But the map is great. He used it. It was able to show us how long that journey was. And so Onesimus shows up in Rome. He's looking for a brand new identity. He is a guy who is constantly looking over his shoulder because he's a slave. He's a runaway. And so in the Roman world, if you were a runaway slave, the punishment, if you're found out, is crucifixion. And so he's constantly looking over his shoulder, looking for a new identity, a new life. And we really don't know how this takes place because what we do know is that Paul and Onesimus, they get together at some point. Paul is already under house arrest, and so Onesimus seeks him out. One of the things I read was it's possible that Onesimus gets in trouble or something, and he looks up Paul because he knows that he played a role in his master's life, and he shows up and he sees Paul. Paul does what Paul does, shares the gospel with him, and he becomes a follower of Christ, and then he tells Onesimus to go back. And so him and Tychicus go back with 2 letters, the letter to the church of Colossae and a letter to Philemon. And can you guys imagine what the journey would have been like for Onesimus back from Rome to Colossae?
Yeah, you're like, am I walking into my crucifixion?
Am I walking to death?
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about how...
Talk about steps of obedience.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about how there are people who maybe they grew up in faith, and when they reach a point in their life, maybe they're in college, maybe they're out of high school. I don't know what the situation is for everybody, but they leave faith for whatever reason.
Kind of like Demas at the end of the letter.
Yeah. And then they come back. Like, there's a lot of people who know what this would have felt like. Maybe they're not marching to their possible death, but they know what that fear and that anxiety and that, man, what will they think of me if I show back up here? They're carrying all those wounds with them. And so to walk into the door or to make a trip from Rome back to home, like, that's a significant step of, as Jeff said, obedience.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine what that journey would have been like for Onesimus.
And here's the thing, you said it well. Onesimus is looking for a new identity, and he's in his running away is where he's seeking identity.
Yep.
And Christ is his new identity.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And even when he runs, God is faithful in the midst of his running away, and right there to meet him.
Yeah.
And that is his new identity that actually takes him back to the household of Philemon.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's some irony in Onesimus' story because his name literally means useful. And as Paul is writing in the book of Philemon, he says that I'm sending Onesimus back to you. Once he was useless, so the opposite of his name. Now, hopefully, he'll be useful to you. And what he means is useful in the kingdom, useful in bringing the gospel. And you start to see later on as you get to both the biblical story of Onesimus and also the church history story of Onesimus, you see that he was very useful in the kingdom from this point on.
Yeah, because he goes back, and there is, which I think is incredible, because as you mentioned earlier, Paul is telling the church of Colossae, hey, this is how you live now.
Yeah.
So Onesimus goes back. He sees Philemon, and think about the testimony and the example this would have been for the church.
It's the real life acting out of what Paul is writing to him.
Yeah.
That's why I really think that's why Philemon gets a whole letter, because
I think you're right.
it's the start of the church there in Colossae early on, and this is the picture of what the gospel does.
Yeah.
This is the picture of what Christ followers do with one another, and it's radical, and it's completely countercultural.
Oh,
you know,
man.
and so Paul's like, listen, this is going to be an example for everyone to see
Yeah.
in how we treat one another, how we love one another, and how the church is going to be together.
Yeah, he says in Philemon that he's like, I think it's verse 4 or 5, but he says like, I could appeal to you on the basis of whatever.
The authority.
Yeah, your
apostolic authority.
Mm-hmm.
But instead I appeal to you with love.
Mm-hmm.
And so Philemon in grace accepts him back. And Paul says this. He says, whatever he's done wrong, Philemon, whatever he owes you, I'll pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, is that Jesus to us?
Mm-hmm.
Like, whatever you've done wrong, I'll come from heaven to earth and I'll pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so he comes back. He is totally restored. He gets back involved with the church. Things are going really well. 7 or so years later, there's this massive earthquake in that region. Totally destroys everything. History tells us that they don't rebuild the city. People, they have to find a new place to live. And so lots of people bounce around all over the place. Onesimus, with several others, go to Ephesus, and he gets plugged in to the church there. John is the lead pastor of that church. And if you follow the timeline, the best I could, in 95, John is exiled to Patmos by the Roman Emperor Domitian. While in Patmos, he receives that revelation from Jesus. Jesus tells him to share it with the churches. John eventually dies, and the church is asking the question, who should be the lead pastor of the church of Ephesus? And they pick Timothy, and that just makes sense. I mean, Paul's protege, right? And then you alluded to church history, tells us that roughly 15 years later, Timothy's dragged in the streets. He's killed by an angry mob.
Yep.
And now the church leaders are asking the question, who should be the pastor of the church? And they get together and decide Onesimus should be the lead pastor of the church of Ephesus. The largest, most influential church in the world.
Yep.
He goes from runaway slave to lead pastor.
Yep.
Incredible story.
It's a similar role. Very similar.
Do what?
Lead pastor and slave. Very similar.
It's how you get your start.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. It's just a beautiful
That's an
story.
awesome story.
Yeah.
Right. So, and kudos to Philemon as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he must have stepped up and offered grace.
Yeah.
To it. Because it was justifiable. It's the law. So he had the legal right. Onesimus was indebted to him, but he chose to offer grace and mercy.
Mm-hmm.
Farley, do you have Philemon open right now?
I don't, but I can get there real quick.
There's a verse in there that I think it might be my favorite verse in the entire letter.
I think I know. Let me read one and see if it's the one that you're
it is.
referring to here.
I think I told you it was my favorite.
No, you didn't. This is just divine intervention here.
Spirit led.
Yeah. Hang on here.
Good thing you know your Bible. So
Yeah.
It's those tabs.
Get those the family books.
Okay, verse 15.
Oh, you knew it.
Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord.
Man, I absolutely love that.
I can't help getting visions in my mind of the prodigal son story.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
The father standing and waiting, looking for the son to come back, offering him restoration instead of the picture of our relationship with the Lord. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but Onesimus wouldn't have known what this letter had said.
Mm-mm.
You know, he's obviously been discipled by
Should
Paul,
have been
but
sealed.
It's sealed.
it's
yeah.
sealed, so he doesn't know what he's delivering back to Paul.
Kill him.
So I just imagine, yeah, like that would have been the rule of law that day. And so really Paul would have been fairly justified in saying that this is where to go. But imagine walking with that, not knowing what's in that letter, and you come back, and not only are you not crucified, but you're welcomed back as a brother, not a slave any longer. You are a brother in the kingdom. Like, wow, that's the gospel.
You imagine like the moment that Onesimus sees Philemon again. Like, what is the first thing out of his mouth? You know, like,
Yeah.
hey, read this letter from our friend Paul.
Yeah,
He's my friend too. All right, don't kill me. But you're right. He doesn't know what it says.
yeah,
And it's this like, he was separated from you for a little while so that you may have him back forever.
yeah.
Listen, like, we're reminded, I think, in that sometimes people we care deeply about, our friends, family members, grandkids, children, whatever, sometimes they seem to run to the other side of the earth. And it's like God is never done writing the story. And we don't know. Maybe they'll come back. We really don't know. But what we do know is God's never done.
Well, I think Paul lays out what our response should be to that at the beginning of this. So keep in mind, these are concurrently running stories. And you see in chapter 4, verse 2, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. And pray for us, too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. That's it. Like, I want to be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have. And I want to be ready to share the gospel with somebody. And so the response to the mother or the father who's waiting for their son or daughter to come back is keep praying and be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have.
Yep.
I like what he goes on to say there. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here trying to contemplate how did Onesimus and Paul really come together. Onesimus, maybe he seeks him out. I don't know.
He would have
Yeah.
had to have, because Paul would have been under house
Or
arrest.
the Spirit just somehow brought them together.
Yeah,
For this
yeah,
this
sure.
story for us. Let your conversation be always full of grace. That's Paul. Let your conversation be full of grace. You know, what a transformation in his life.
Yeah.
Seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And he's just really imploring that we speak the truth in love, that we say the right thing the right way,
Yep.
so that others can see Christ.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, this is kind of speculation on my part, but I just imagine like Onesimus going to Paul and feeling this massive amount of guilt and going to Paul and almost with this from the standpoint of, man, you don't know what I've done. You know, you don't know how bad I've been. And then he's standing in front of Paul, like the guy who has literally persecuted the church and is
Murdered
now...
Would he have been marked as a slave? I mean, physically, would he have been marked, do you think?
It depends
I've
because
heard several different things.
yeah, it just kind of depends on what level of slavery he was at.
Yeah.
So his ability to hide may indicate that he might not have been marked.
Yeah, most of the stuff I had read about him, it was more of like this self-indentured
Yeah.
slave. So this idea that he couldn't take care of himself, and so he was putting his life under Philemon's care and submitting his life, to Philemon.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many connections here to the gospel, because it's like he runs from his master,
Yeah, the one who is providing
the one who's
for him.
providing for him. That's us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the lesson. One of the lessons here is, like that the fact that Jesus loves the runaway, and we're all the runaway. Like, that's our story. We are Onesimus in this story. We read it and we might think, oh, maybe we're Paul, maybe we're Philemon. We would accept back. No, we are Onesimus.
Yep.
We're the runaway.
I think too, as you look at the closing of Colossians 4, there is you see a picture of the early church community. Like, there's a bunch of names, and they're in the fight together. And there's an encouragement going on, and in our Western context, I think this is becoming more and more of a problem. Is we think we can do it on our own.
Yeah.
And we listen to a sermon online, we do a Bible study, online or, with ourselves and we call it good. And it's like, no, there's a whole group of people who are addressed here. And this is just one location, of like, hey, you guys are in the fight together. Let's keep going. Let's like make sure we're living these things out together to see the gospel made known.
Yeah.
That's an interesting contrast to me, the very last verse of Colossians, to the story of Onesimus and Philemon. Onesimus had run away and was free, and Paul tells him to go back. But look what he says at the end. I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. He says that a lot at the end of letters. But remember my chains. So he's told the runaway to go back to the slave owner, but he's got these chains. Of course, we know that he's referring to the physical chains he has, but he really isn't looking at the physical chains here, I don't think. He's talking about the fact that he's in these physical chains because of his slavery to Christ, and he's submitted himself as a servant of the Lord, and that's brought this consequence on him. But he's okay with that.
Yep. Well, and to be honest, this is like, it stunk for Paul, but it's awesome for us because this is where 90% of the New Testament comes from.
Yeah.
Is this time when he's under house arrest. Just think how many Roman guards heard the gospel.
Oh, I know.
You know what I'm saying? Like, you just wonder what that effect was that's not even recorded, but they're going home and talking to their families at night. You won't believe this guy that, we have to sit around and make sure he doesn't run away. And, like.
And everybody that shows up to see him, he shares the gospel with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can just imagine, like, the impact God used with him being in a stationary
Which is a
place.
whole nother lesson in itself. You know what I mean? Like, in suffering, his response is joy. It's just, man, it's...
Yeah.
You can go
But you're not going to be around Paul without hearing the gospel.
No.
Right.
And it's like, wow. And I think it causes some self-reflection. Like, man, if I'm around people, will they know?
Even without words.
Yeah.
Like, will they know by the way that we live and walk around and
Yeah.
communicate? Yeah.
Yep.
I imagine Paul just so bold.
Yeah.
I mean, he lays it out there. It's like he's got no time to waste.
Yep.
Good
Cool.
story. Anything else you want to wrap it up with?
That's
Got it
all
all
I got
covered.
to say about
That's
that.
all we got to say.
So my question to you is this: it just took us 22 minutes to discuss this. How long did you preach? Longer than that.
Longer than that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
We got to work on this.
I had a whole lot of things to say, Jeff.
Well, go read the book of Philemon because it literally takes 2.5 minutes to read.
It's quick.
And man, a short story, but wow.
It is.
It's a great one.
It is powerful for sure. So, next week, where are we headed, Jeff? I mean, you're kicking off a series.
Yeah, we're kicking off a series from Ephesians.
Both of you
So-
two are.
Yep.
We'll do Ephesus, and part of this you've alluded to the histories of what's transpiring there and the power of what God uses there. It's a beautiful, powerful letter, and
When is
probably
it?
second to Romans, would we say, in theological stuff.
Yeah.
It's good.
When is
solid.
it written? What's the time frame?
I don't know. We'll talk about that next week.
Perfect.
Thanks for joining us on the ReThink podcast.